This lecture is the first lecture of a two-part series on the art of the Neolithic period. This lecture is going to address architecture, and then the second lecture is going to address sculpture and painting. Now, the slide that you see up on the screen, this is a familiar slide to you because it appeared in our earlier Paleolithic lecture. And so I just want to go over some of the changes and remind you of the very important context that's going to explain the type of architecture that we're going to be looking at in this lecture. So, as you know, we have the Paleolithic period. And this period is a time when human beings were nomadic. They moved around to follow weather patterns, to see any architecture being produced during this time. Now, they did build these like mammoth bone huts, but these are something that art historians don't really look at. They're strictly functional. It's kind of hard for us to look at skill or creativity or deeper meanings beyond simply shelter. And nothing that was permanent or really large or taking a lot of work or anything like that, because it didn't make sense to invest time, energy, resources, which all three of these are valuable and in short supply, to create something that you're just going to walk away from. Now, what changes between the Paleolithic and Neolithic period is the domestication of crops and the cultivation of animals. Now, once these two things start to happen, there's no longer a need to be nomadic. You can stay in one place. Your food source is right there. Once people started to stay in one place for longer periods of time, now it did make sense to invest the time, the energy, the resources. You're going to be there to continually interact with them. And that's the major change that we're going to see when we look at this lecture, is we're moving away from the mobiliary, small-scale, portable works to things that are epic in their size, and they're very, very permanent. We'll start with the Newgrange Passage tomb. And this is an example of what I was talking about, megalithic architecture. So mega means large, lithic means stone, large-scale stone architecture. And you can see right in here these stairs. It kind of gives you a sense of scale. So to see really how large in size this structure was. Now, this structure is important because what it indicates to us is the cooperative artistic process. Cooperative artistic process. The operative word there is cooperation. Do you think that one person or a small group of people could build something of this magnitude on their own? No. There needed to be a lot of people cooperating in order to make this structure a possibility. Okay? Now, consider this. What was it used for? It was a tomb. Do you think that every single person who lived within this area was laid to rest in this tomb? The answer is no. This tomb was reserved for a few individuals. So obviously these people are special because they're getting laid to rest in a super sweet tomb, and you and I are being put in a hole in the ground somewhere. Now, if we think about it then, we've got all these people cooperating to build an amazing tomb for a select group of people that get to have a tomb and we don't get to be in it. What's that all about? Now, some people could say slaves. These people somehow had slaves, and that they were able to have these slaves create this. Maybe, maybe not. as far as I know, there's no architectural indication that these people had slaves. But the thing is you can't just have people donating their time to build a tomb. They need things like food and shelter. So even if you're not paying these people, even if they're slaves, you still have to clothe them, you still have to feed them, you still have to shelter them. And if these are workers, that you have to pay them, and they'll use that money for their shelter, their food, whatever. What I'm saying is you have people that have so much extra resources that they're able to either to somehow compensate a workforce in order for that workforce to build this structure. Now, what this is evidencing to us is the beginning of an emergence of some sort of hierarchy. Now, this isn't to say there wasn't hierarchy in the Paleolithic period. There may have been, but those expressions of hierarchy were much more, what's the word I want to use? They were much more discreet. So it might be like a shell necklace or like a special animal pelt. Where here, it's this like giant tomb that everybody is able to see. And probably a lot of people participated in building. And so this is where we start to see expressions of power begin to come into play. So somehow these people are able to get enough resources that it puts them above everybody else. And there's that cooperation. Now, this tomb is what we call a cairn. And there's your spelling right there. A cairn is a mound. It's a mounded tomb. So this is not like a natural hill that someone just dug into. This is a mounded tomb that was constructed. You can see that when you look here at this detail. And it's called a passage tomb because there's a passage. And that passage leads straight into the middle here. So there's a few terms that we can use to describe it. It's megalithic, it's large, and it's stone. It's a cairn, it's a mounded tomb, and it's a passage tomb where you have a passage leading into the middle. Now, this structure also has alongside of it some decoration, some linear patterning. Linear just refers to lines. And these linear designs are in this circular pattern. And what's interesting about these designs is that they actually are common in the exterior and interior of the structure. So if I can show you, here's a detail of the interior. You can see the spirals replicated. Now, in terms of what these spirals mean, we're not entirely sure. Now, according to that Greek guy with the crazy hair on Ancient Aliens, he thinks these are alien hieroglyphs. So you can definitely see that as an option. Another option, and this is a pretty vague one, is that they somehow represent the cosmos, the stars, the movement of the sky as different astrological events happen. And of course, though, I need to back that up with some kind of evidence. And the evidence is that this structure was not just randomly built wherever, but it was very specifically positioned. It was positioned in a way that when the sun rose on the morning of the winter solstice, it perfectly alighted the passage inside. Now, this is kind of a shortcut in this class. We're going to see a lot of structures that are very specifically aligned to the stars, the sky, the sun, or even the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Anytime you ever see that, you can immediately say celestial symbolism, and you'll be right. That there's some kind of symbolism that's being communicated through this really specific interaction between the structure and how it's positioned and the sky. Now that's vague. Just saying celestial symbolism is vague. But something is better than nothing. Now let's move on to Stonehenge. This is a super famous structure. Probably the most famous structure, not only of like all time, but definitely of the Neolithic period. And it's so famous, it's so mysterious, it gets all the attention. But actually, and many are not aware of this, Stonehenge, as you see here, it's not standalone. This was actually part of a wider sacred landscape. I'm not going to go into Stonehenge in depth in this lecture because I've provided to you a reading in your collection of readings this week that will detail this structure in depth. What I want to focus with the lecture is on the surrounding areas. Now this is a map that's got a lot going on, but we'll look through it and it'll give you a sense of where we're at. Now I just want to point out, this is Stonehenge right in here, and this is the avenue. Now if you haven't done the readings yet, which is totally fine, you'll probably be like, I don't know what the avenue is, but you will know about the avenue once you do your readings. Now overall, the site that you see here, it comprises of roughly 4 square miles. So that's pretty good size. And it's populated by numerous structures and numerous burial sites. And in fact, these green dots that we see all throughout here, burial sites. So quite a bit. And it's the study of these structures that have provided us with some of the more recent developments in terms of our understanding of this site. Now, it's not the knowledge that these ancillary sites existed that's new to us. We've known this for some time. For example, Woodhenge, which you see right in here, this was discovered all the way back in 1926, for example. But rather, it's the increased attention to these structures that's new. And part of this has been encouraged by the application of technology to archaeology. So using things like ground penetrating radar gives us a sense of what lies below, and we can take a peek without disturbing fragile layers of archaeological material. And then another thing, for example, is there's been advances made in carbon dating, which allow us to reconstruct more accurate chronologies. Now, the first area I want to take a look at is this really long oblong area here called the Cursus. Now, this area was named in the 18th century. So as I said, we've known this has been around for a long time, this area. In the 18th century, there was an antiquarian by the name of William B. Stuckley, and he made a misattribution. He incorrectly assumed that he was looking at a Roman race course, so he named it the Cursus. Now, the construction of the Cursus is actually believed to predate that of Stonehenge, somewhere between 3630 and 3375 BCE. And this was 3 kilometers long and 100 feet wide. And here's a crazy thing, okay? Dug by hand, okay? If you've ever tried to dig a hole, it's exhausting. Dug by hand using antler picks, which I think is even crazier. So a lot invested in creating this Cursus. And associated with this site were barrows, which essentially are mounds, and there were mass graves located in these mounds. Now, the Cursus runs from east to west, and this is an alignment that's consistent with the spring and autumn equinox sunrises. Now, we don't know what's the function of this, but it seems safe to suggest that it had some sort of ceremonial function, on top of the fact that it was used for or somehow connected to all of these burials that are situated around the perimeters. Now, the other area I want to look at is right here, Durrington Walls. Initial excavations of this area took place between 2004 and 2006, and they were led by Michael Parker Pearson, who is the expert on Stonehenge. And it's believed that this area was a builder's camp, and in this capacity, it may have been the largest Neolithic village. with about 1,000 domestic structures and a population of approximately 4,000 people. That's pretty sizable for such a long time ago. Durrington Walls was only in use for about 45 or 50 years, and that's why it's been identified as a builder's camp. They didn't need to occupy the site long term, and we also think it's a builder's camp because there was a large amount of tools discovered at this site. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that there's a lack of graves. So you can see like all these green spots everywhere, but we don't see green spots over here. Lack of graves. And this has led to the theory that this wider landscape, this 4 miles, was actually divided up conceptually. That Durrington Walls and this area here was conceived of as being the land of the living, while Stonehenge and its surrounding areas was considered to be the land of the dead. Now, this idea is supported by Durrington Walls' close proximity to Woodhenge. Wood is considered to be a material associated with the living, while stone, which we see was used to build Stonehenge, that is a material associated with the dead. Now, these 2 examples that we looked at, Newgrange and Stonehenge, these were examples of architecture from Northern Europe. And these were special structures that probably were not for everyday use, except for Durrington Walls. You've got an epic tomb with this amazing interaction with winter solstice sun. You have with Stonehenge an extensive ceremonial complex and a burial ground. So let's take a look at some examples of domestic architecture. This would be something that you and I would get to interact with on a daily basis if we lived way back in the 7th millennium BCE. This is the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük, and this was located in Anatolia, which is a place that's now modern-day Turkey. And as of now, as we know it, it's the largest known settlement from this time period to have been discovered in the Near East. Now, what we see in the reconstruction is we see the city planning and the architectural design. And you can see that the homes were very densely packed together. We can even use this word urban to kind of describe what that situation's all about. These houses were packed so together that, as you can see if you look at the details, there's no streets, but rather people traveled along the rooftops. The houses, which were made of mud, brick, and timber frames, as you can see, were single-storied, and access was from the top. You can see little doors. That's how you got in the house. The walls themselves were solid. And it's believed the structures were built this way, close together, solid walls, as a means to provide defense. Now, the homes, they were furnished and they were decorated, so it was a comfortable place for somebody to live. They had furniture, they had benches that were made of clay, and they likely used these benches for sitting and for sleeping. In some of the structures, the walls were plastered, which allowed for the inclusion of paintings, which is something that we can see in this reconstruction here. Now, the paintings are special, and this has encouraged some scholars to argue that they were to indicate that the space was not a domestic space, but rather a shrine. I want to say that we have to be careful here because it's not clear if this is a home or if it's a shrine, and the archaeological evidence isn't helping us very much yet with this interpretation. Now, in your readings, you're going to read about another Neolithic settlement called Jericho. These people interred plastered skulls of deceased family members underneath their homes. The people of Çatalhöyük, they practiced something similar. They too put remains of their family members under the homes. Some of the skeletons were covered in a red ochre, which was like a red pigment, and other colored pigments sometimes, like blue and green. And to have your skeleton or your remains covered in pigment was probably a marker of status. There also were other people who were laid to rest with jewelry and weapons, and that probably was meant to be an indication of status as well. Now, Göbekli Tepe is another site from ancient Anatolia, and this one is near an ancient settlement called Ufra. And what's really interesting about this structure is that it's forcing scholarships to rethink how exactly to define the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods. Now, we talked about this extensively in our lectures on the Paleolithic and here in Neolithic architecture. Nomadic groups came first. They were followed by groups with more sophisticated social organization that, for example, allowed for the cooperative artistic process. And this was made possible by staying in one place for longer periods of time as they tended to their newly planted fields of crops and their newly domesticated animals. However, limited carbon dating indicates that this structure, this site, was built more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge. So that actually would date it to the Paleolithic period. Now remember, I said at the beginning of this lecture that it was during the Neolithic period that we first see the construction of megalithic architecture. But this much earlier structure, it's looking pretty megalithic to me. You can see with the people, these little dots, that gives you a sense of scale. Now here's the other detail that changes the conversation. Göbekli Tepe is believed to be the world's oldest temple. And this is a theory supported by the fact that as of yet, archaeologists have not discovered any evidence of everyday living, ashes from cooking fires, trash, that sort of thing. So if this is indeed a large temple that was built during the Paleolithic period, it would indicate that there was institutionalized religious beliefs, meaning that people actively organized according to common beliefs, which would be a challenge for nomadic groups. And that's the point. According to some scholars, it was not the domestication of animals or the cultivation of crops that made people want to settle down in one place, but actually, it was the desire to cooperate to build large-scale megaliths. It's an interesting argument considering how social humans are. This idea that it would be social change that would cause the lifestyles to change, and that social change would come before technological change. Now, there's still a lot to learn here. The site has only been studied since about 1995, which isn't that long. And I think it's only something like 5% of the site has been excavated so far. So these theories, they may be proven or they may be disproven. So we can't go back and rewrite, the narratives and say, oh, we have to redefine Paleolithic and Neolithic. We can't do it yet. But the discovery of this site and its excavation is at least encouraging us to consider that fact. Very interesting stuff, and we will get to learn more in our next lecture on Neolithic sculpture and painting.